Happy Friday, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our, I don't know what number meeting this is of September. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and we'll get started in just a few moments.
Hey everyone, I'll just add that before we opened up the meeting, we were discussing our latest binge shows, streaming recommendations. So if anyone has any of those, we'll take them. Sister, Sister, and Schitt's Creek were rising to the top.
We're having a little issue with our captions today, but if anyone needs them specifically, there is a link in the chat. Christina Carroll put it in. So if you need the captions, please find the link in the chat or let us know. We can put it right back in as well.
Taking notes on these recommendations. Oh, Buffy Temple. Good call.
All right, let's get started. As people keep continuing to introduce and give the great recommendations for Netflix and or Hulu, whichever service it is, please let us know. Christina, could you get us to the next slide, please?
Great. All right. Hi, everybody. We'll start with our public health update and then turn it over. We've got a few people jumping in today. I hope everyone is hanging in as well as is possible. I can't believe it's mid-September. So we are seeing as of today 15,374 confirmed cases of COVID in Boston residents. Over 11,000 of those have fully recovered, and we haven't seen any new deaths, which is always good news. For the week ending September 5th, the 7-day average positive test rate was 1.5%, and we see that continuing to go in the right direction. Over 3,200 Boston residents are being tested every day, and colleges account for roughly half of that number. And we're going to hear a little bit more about colleges from Danny Green and what we're doing to support them and how they're reopening and dealing with students and dealing with testing. You might remember from the last time that we talked, the positive test rate in East Boston was at 11.4%, and the city was really targeting outreach and testing there. Now that positive test rate is down to 6.6%. So it's still obviously high and more work to do, but also really great to see that number come down already. The mobile testing unit will be staying in East Boston for another week. And in the meantime, every other neighborhood's positive test rate is under 4%, and most are under 3%. I also wanted to share some updates this week from the mayor on the city's work to confront systemic racism. So you remember that in June, the mayor declared racism a public health crisis in the city of Boston. And one of the action items resulting from that was the creation of a police reform task force. So this week, that task force is announcing 5 main draft recommendations. The first is to create an Office of Police Accountability and Transparency with the power to investigate complaints and subpoena witnesses and evidence. The second is to strengthen the work the police department does on diversity and inclusion specifically on hiring and making sure that the police department reflects the demographics of Boston and that diverse candidates are promoted within the department to leadership positions. The third recommendation was to expand the body-worn camera program. The fourth is related to use of force policies, making sure that the rules and consequences of using force are clear to both officers and clear to the public. And the fifth recommendation was to adopt practices around record keeping and data to ensure transparency and public access. And I would add to ensure public accountability. So starting next week, the task force is going to take written comments on this, and there will be a public listening session on Tuesday, September 22nd, and that's the web address for keeping up to date with this information, boston.gov/ending racism. And I think just given all of the anti-racist work and statements and conversations that I've been having here and in the arts community and obviously beyond, this is a really great opportunity for people on this call to help circulate this this information and the civic participation. Make sure people know that this is coming out and that they can comment on it, that they can participate in the listening session. So anything you can do to make sure that people know that this work is happening and that they have an opportunity to weigh in is much appreciated. And I think just a piece of housekeeping to wrap me up here is that we did move to every other week for the call. So if you received a whole bunch of emails of updating from Zoom or from a calendar invite, that's what's going on because we had booked these out through the rest of the year. So feel free to ignore or delete or remove yourself from the calendar invite, but that's what's happening. We just updated that to be every other week. I think that is it for me. And now I'm going to pass it over to Danny to talk about colleges and universities. Is that right, Pascal? Great.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Cara. And thanks for having me on this call today. Good afternoon. I think I've met a lot of folks on the call, but for those who I don't know, my name is Danny Green, and I'm Mayor Walsh's Deputy Chief of Policy. Cara asked if I would come on today and talk briefly about where we are with fall reopening for Boston's colleges and universities, and all the work that the administration has done with the higher ed community to open safely and under state and city guidance. I'm going to try to get through a lot of information in a very brief amount of time, so please bear with me. So knowing that the fall generally sees a huge influx of college students coming to Boston from across the country, and not knowing what this fall would look like, especially given the specter of COVID around us all, we put together a cross-departmental team back in May that has been in close contact with all of Boston's colleges and universities just to get a handle on what the fall would look like and to inform all the plans for reopening. You can see on this slide a sort of logo soup in the top right-hand corner, but this kind of cross-departmental team has been working really closely and includes the Mayor's Office, Boston Public Health Commission, Health and Human Services, the BPDA, Inspectional Services, Licensing Board, Neighborhood Services, and Economic Development. It's such a huge impact on the city of Boston that it really is all hands on deck. So we really started to try to get a handle on the fall back in May with a call between the mayor and all of the local college and university presidents on May 12th to begin planning for fall reopening. And that was followed up a week later with just the smaller commuter colleges that don't have residential campuses. Based on what we heard from our initial conversations, the city team began developing reopening guidance of its own over the summer. Additionally, over the summer, we put together an internal team from the BPDA, Health Commission, Inspectional Services, and Licensing, who put a process together to allow colleges and universities to de-densify their residential campuses using hotels and private apartments, which I'll get into in a couple slides. As colleges were getting closer to solidifying their fall plans over the summer, we reconvened all of the college presidents in late July to go over the city's reopening guidance that we had issued and asked each institution to submit reopening and infection control plans for review, which brought us to kind of the end of August, beginning of September, during which the city and the Public Health Commission jointly held individual COVID preparedness meetings with each college and university that submitted a plan. So I'll kind of talk about that a little bit on the next slide, please. Great. So numbers, who's actually here? What does the fall look like? We identified a universe of 26 colleges and universities that have a physical campus in the city of Boston. Of those 26, 5 told us that their fall semester is entirely remote. There will be no students on campus at those 5 and no physical impact to the city. We received a full impact plan from the remaining 21, and a team made up of the city and the Public Health Commission went through each of those 21 submitted plans with senior officials from each institution. Based on what they told us, we do have some estimated numbers as of August 20th, which you can see here. I want to caution that these numbers are a bit squishy and they're still a moving target. But it does look like there are about 50,000 students returning to Boston for this fall semester. That breaks down to about 23,600 in on-campus dorms and about 20,000 in private off-campus housing. This is about half of the housing numbers we see in a normal year. So just for comparison, last year in 2019 in the fall, we saw about 41,000 students in dorms and about 36,000 in private off-campus housing. So the numbers are definitely down, but that's still a pretty large impact with 50,000 students here in Boston. Next slide, please. Great. So while we were reviewing each institution's control plan, we asked each college and university to specifically address their move-in plan. So we asked them to address a whole number of things, and we went over this in meetings with senior officials from each institution that lasted more than an hour each. So what we asked them for in these control plans and what we talked to them specifically about were a number of things, including their move-in plans, which included plans for on-campus quarantine for students who traveled from high-risk states, each institution's testing protocols for students, staff, faculty, and vendors, social distancing and hygiene protocols, cleaning and disinfecting, communication and support for the college community, and isolation and quarantine procedures in the case of positive tests. Contact tracing was another really important part of these conversations. Most of the colleges and universities we've talked to will be sharing responsibility for contact tracing with the Boston Public Health Commission, and we've established really strong points of contact with each institution to share that responsibility going forward. Since we reviewed the initial control plans, we've been in constant continued communication with the colleges and have asked them to make a number of commitments, which include making sure to report positive cases to the Public Health Commission immediately, promoting COVID reduction strategies to their students and faculty, providing frequent reminders about social distancing, prohibiting parties and limiting group sizes. You've probably seen a number of these instances in the news. Staying informed of all relevant state, federal, and local regulations. We asked them to communicate regularly with their communities, including their surrounding residential neighborhoods. Ideally, we've asked them, each institution, to hold some sort of a virtual weekly meeting or office hour. We've been reiterating that message. We think it's really important for the colleges and universities to be in direct contact in these really uncertain times with not just their direct communities, but also just the neighborhoods that they impact. And then finally, to participate in a weekly mandatory all-college check-in with the city and the Public Health Commission, where we can just keep an eye on what's happening on the ground and be in constant communication with them. Next slide, please. Great. So earlier I mentioned that we created a process for colleges to use hotels in order to de-densify their residential campuses. And this is important for a couple of reasons. It helps to reduce the spread of COVID on campus by only having one student to a dorm room, and also helps to support the hotel industry in this time where we're not seeing the usual tourism and conference convention traffic that we normally would see. So you can see on this side, there are currently 8 institutions who have been approved to use hotels and other private housing. And that makes up about 2,300 students in these living situations. You can see in the map which institutions are using hotels in this fashion and where the hotels and apartments are. In order to be approved, they had to submit detailed plans that cover the proposed uses of each space, their move-in details, and operations and management policies. And also, and this was really important to us, they had to engage in a public process that included both their local elected officials, but also reaching out to any civic or residential groups that abutted their campus or the private space, hotel, or apartment where they were planning to house students. And then next slide, please. Great, so this all brings us to the present. So I mentioned earlier that we had asked all of the colleges to participate in a mandatory weekly all-college meeting. The first one of those was actually held yesterday, so I can report a little bit of what we talked about and kind of what we're seeing on the ground now. We had nearly 100% attendance. Only one institution wasn't represented. I'm not going to rat them out, but that was pretty good, and we have been in contact with them right afterwards. And during the call, we raised some pretty important concerns going forward and came up with a few solutions. For example, we asked each institution to identify a point of contact so that they can all contact each other in the case of a student from one institution living with a student from another institution and testing positive for COVID. In that case, we need to make sure that both institutions and the city need to know as soon as possible to begin all the respective isolation, quarantine, contact tracing protocols that may differ from school to school. We also reminded each institution that the city has a limit on indoor gatherings of 25 people, and therefore we would like to see no in-person classes exceeding that number. We also asked each institution what their plans are in terms of whether students will be returning to campus after Thanksgiving break and what their plans to quarantine upon arrival will be, especially if they're coming from higher risk states. We will be collecting calendars from each institution so we know who was here when, at what point during the semester, and basically when their semesters will be closing. And the last thing that I will say is kind of reiterating what Cara said at the beginning of her presentation, is that the testing that the colleges are now doing is now reflected as part of the city's overall testing numbers. This past week, we saw for the first time a major uptick in testing citywide, especially in the Fenway and Roxbury neighborhoods, and this is due mainly to the colleges now having their testing protocols up and running. There are still a few smaller institutions who don't have testing capacity on their own yet, and we're working with them to create partnerships with local community health centers to help fill that need. These are some of the really, really small schools, but who just don't have the capacity on their own, but we're trying to fill that need wherever we possibly can. I'm gonna stop there, but I'm gonna hang on the call until the end if there are any questions or if anything comes up in the chat. I'm happy to answer whatever. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Danny. Truly appreciate that. We can go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to pass it over to Kim from NEFA.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Zito, Program Director of Public Art at the New England Foundation for the Arts. And I'm going to just share a couple of our new opportunities that we've launched in this pandemic moment. As COVID-19 remains a threat to our public health and our public spaces continue to be plagued with racial injustices, NEFA, like many of our organizations, published a commitment to racial justice earlier this year. And in the public art team, we've taken this moment to restructure some of our grant-making programs and launch 2 new grant opportunities that specifically focus on supporting public art practices through a spatial justice framework. Borrowing this phrase from our colleagues at the Design Studio for Social Intervention, we're really looking at supporting public art that is thinking about who has the right to be, thrive, express, and connect in public spaces. So the first grant opportunity that I wanted to share is our Collective Imagination for Spatial Justice grant. And remembering that social imagination is a prerequisite to positive social change. These grants are supporting artists, creatives, community collaborators to come together and do that work of collective imagination, to think about public spaces and to think about what it would take to create more just, more vibrant public spaces before having to put together a proposal where you're predicting what that's going to be in terms of a public art project. So this is not a project grant. It's to focus on that work of building collaboration and imagination, really questioning, who does and who doesn't have the right to be, thrive, express, connect in our public spaces, and how do we support more just versions of our publics through public art. I put in there the website for the grant page for this grant, and we do have 2 deadlines coming up for these grants, where one's in September, one's in October. It's kind of a pseudo rolling deadline, so there's multiple entry points for folks to apply for these opportunities. And the second opportunity, next slide, is our Public Art for Spatial Justice grant. Recognizing that folks have been doing the work of imagination, we've had a lot of time to marinate this year. These grants are supporting artistic collaborations that are fostering, supporting artistic collaborations that are creating public art that's fostering public imagination and contributing to more just futures for our public spaces and public culture. And I should mention that both of these opportunities are open to artists and collaborators across the state of Massachusetts. So unlike our other opportunities that were more focused on Boston and the greater Boston area, these are open statewide. So if you have other collaborators across the state, please feel free to share these opportunities with them. And the deadlines are the same, September 21st and October 19th. And in addition to pivoting our grant making in our public art department, we've also launched a couple of discussion series that I thought I'd also bring to your attention. Next slide, I can't remember. Oh yes, okay. Yeah, so we just wrapped up a spatial justice discussion series in partnership with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and the Design Studio for Social Intervention. It was a 3-part online series, discussion series that explored the role that planners, artists, and government staff can play in shaping more just, more inclusive public spaces. And they were all recorded, so you can go to the MAPC website and the link is there if you'd like to go back and view any of those. And coming up in a couple of weeks, we have another series that we are launching. Next slide. It's our Public Art, Public Memory discussion series, also co-hosted in partnership with MAPC and the Design Studio for Social Intervention. And we're looking at, how do monuments and memorials shape our experience of public space? How do we define who is the public? And what should we do about the monuments that no longer reflect or our shared history and collective values? The first 2 sessions, it's a 4-part series that starts September 22nd. It's Tuesday evenings from 4 to 5:30. And the first 2 will be more panel discussion, and the last 2 will actually be more workshop space for municipal staff, community organizations to dive in a little bit deeper with Monument Lab, who will be co-hosting these workshops to think about, what does this look like in our own communities, in our own spaces? So if you are interested, feel free to tune in. You can register for 1 or all 4 of these events at the link on this slide. And last but not least, next slide, kind of, we planned a lot for the fall over the last few months, but the overlapping with the Public Art, Public Memory discussion series is a virtual symposium focusing on centering Indigenous artist perspectives on public art and public spaces. Recognizing that this is the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower's arrival, we recognize that there are a lot of events that were meant to take place this year in our state, and we wanted to create some space to lift up Indigenous artist perspectives and as we think about what does it mean to commemorate, to remember, to memorialize, and to think about their role in public art. So we've got a lot of cool content coming out this month, and we'd love for you to tune in. You can see the links in the slide, but also I can pop them in the chat after. I think that's it. Those are all my slides, I think.
Thanks, Kim. Like we normally do for these meetings, I'll be sending the PowerPoint with the recap email. So if anybody needs access to that, you should get that after the meeting today. All right, next up, we have Emily Ruddock from Mass Creative to give us a little update about what's happening at the federal and state level.
Hi all, I'm having a few technical difficulties, so if I speed up or freeze, apologies. So really quickly, after a somewhat quiet August in terms of sort of activities to update you all on. So yesterday, the Senate, the US Senate voted on a skinny bill, which is the Senate's new version of the 4th stimulus bill. So this is not the HEROES Act. This is only like a $1 trillion bill. And it failed. It failed along party lines, and there's some wisdom to be said that there was not a real hope that it was ever going to pass, but that doesn't mean it is still not frustrating to see sort of inaction happen, particularly around state and local aid and around additional funding and support and relief for the arts and cultural sector through the NEA, the NIH, IML, and IMLS, and Corporation for Public Broadcasting. There is very little hope that a fourth stimulus bill will pass before the November general election. That's just sort of where we are right now, but we've been surprised before. The other thing that's happening sort of largely on the federal level is that the fiscal year 21 appropriations, which is like the how does the business of government happen on the federal level, is quickly approaching, right? So it's it still hasn't passed out of Congress. That's not unusual. We've seen in the past when they've had to go into continuing resolutions to just keep like the doors of government open. So that's not like, whoa, what's happening? But it's just something that we're monitoring. I mean, obviously NEA, NEH, and IMLS sort of annual appropriations are through that process. So it's just something that we at Mass Creative are monitoring, thanks largely to the leadership of Americans for the Arts. There are two actual bills and then one additional piece of legislation that I just want to update you on the federal level. So the Restart Act and the Save Our Stages Act, which are pieces of legislation we've talked about before, which are really about trying to help provide relief to live venues and live performance operators. Nothing's happened. The Be an Arts Hero Coalition, which is a national, intentionally intersectional coalition of artists, performers, and live venue operators and organizations, is putting there a lot of support behind the Dawn Act. In another life, I just want the job of getting to come up with the titles of the bills to have like really smart nicknames attached to them. So if anyone's hiring, that's a dream job of mine. So the Dawn Act would put together a $44 billion relief package that would be administrated by the various sort of arts and cultural agencies, and would specifically provide grants for individuals and orgs that have been impacted by COVID-19. This is not a bill yet, but the Be an Arts Hero Coalition is working on a letter of support for what this bill would become that you can take a look at, and if you want to engage on, that link is in the slide, which Pascal will send along. Christina, next slide, if you will. So the other big item that's on the table federally is that thanks to the leadership of Americans for the Arts and a number of other sort of national arts policy actors, a policy proposal was put together called Putting Creative Workers Back to Work. And this includes 15 specific actions that the next administration can take to take care of the creative economy right now as part of like a national recovery strategy. The focus is very clearly on creative workers and artists and centering the needs of the individual creative worker in this moment, which is exciting to see happen. And then there are sort of 5 areas underneath which those specific actions are sort of nestled. And it's how do you get direct employment? How are you thinking about more sort of collaborative ways of activating creative workers towards larger community policy goals, as well as talking about arts education, right? Which is something that we know is at risk in this moment. So Mass Creative and through the Mass Creative Policy Committee has formally endorsed this policy proposal. It is being hosted on Americans for the Arts website, and those hyperlinks, which will be in the slide deck that Pascal sends out afterwards, will take you to the full review of what that policy is. And then if you as an organization or you as an individual want to endorse that and join over 760 others to say this is a clear path forward that we should support, including the city of Boston. There are a couple of other Massachusetts-based arts and cultural organizations that have already signed on. You can do that, and Mass Creative heartily encourages you to do that. So I think one of the really important points here is that we are all recognizing that the road to recovery is going to be a long one, and we need to start putting together recommendations and being creative in the ways that we think about providing relief and recovery. So that's what this also is a part of. I believe, and Ruby, Ruby Harper from Americans for the Arts will probably be able to confirm this for me, but that this policy proposal has been made available to both the Biden, Harris, and the Trump Pence campaigns for president, because that would be the administration that one of those that would take over this policy innovation. But if I'm wrong, Ruby, you're always welcome to correct me. So next slide. We are moving on to the state. So thank you. So the Baker administration announced that announced that there has been a lost wages assistance program that's been activated. So even before the pandemic hit Massachusetts, through FEMA, right, there were ways and existing like mechanisms to help provide relief to those who were unemployed because of a national or natural disaster. And so this lost wages assistance program is one of those things. When the the federal unemployment pandemic assistance compensation, which was that additional like $300 to $600 depending on your income level, ended at the end of August, the Baker administration formally applied to FEMA to get this lost wages program up and running. So we're really happy to hear that FEMA authorized that grant fund for us, for the Massachusetts. And so if you are unemployed and you have made claims for those following weeks that are listed, you will see that an additional $300 is added to your unemployment. This, for the most part, will happen automatically if you're already in the system. And the other thing that's important to note, it's for both traditional unemployment assistance and then also the pandemic unemployment assistance. So if you're an independent contractor and you had qualified for pandemic unemployment assistance, you are included in this. That's a good thing to know that is happening. The other big thing is just as schools went back into session and we all returned from our Labor Day break, the legislature went back into formal session. So we've talked about this before, that they voted to extend their formal session. They voted to change the rules so that they could have formal sessions all the way into December 31st. But then we saw in August, a lot of folks went back to run for office, right? Because the primaries were happening and they went into informal sessions for most of August. So they are back now, and we fully anticipate that we are going to start seeing a lot more activity on the state level happen around legislation that we care about. So if you have not already, or you feel like it's a good time to do it again, you can contact your state senator and your representative to voice your support of the economic development bond bill that's currently in conference committee, which means they're working out both versions, the House and the Senate version of that bond bill, and we want to make sure that all the provisions for the arts and cultural community are retained in that final version. The other thing that we're looking at, and I just want to sort of like wave a big ol' like red flag we should be paying attention to, is that their fiscal year 21 budget, right? The state budget. So we know that there was a 3-month spending bill that was basically like level spending based on the rates from fiscal year 20, which was our prior year, right? Was put into place, and it'll end on Halloween. And so the legislature has to figure out what they're going to do, right? And everybody who is paying attention to this has their own guesses, right? They'll do another 3 months. They'll do a 6-month. They'll actually do the rest of the fiscal year, right? We're watching that and paying attention really closely to that. The trick is, right, is in this 3-month spending bill, there's no grant money. It's just keeping the business of government going. And so the Mass Cultural Council put together a really useful update article a month ago that I highly recommend everybody take a look at, because it just sort of tells you exactly what it means to have this 3-month spending bill and why frankly, why it matters for us to be paying attention to this and urging the legislature to put together a full version, right? Because many of our arts and cultural organizations rely on public funds that are distributed through the Mass Cultural Council granting program, and right now we're not getting that. The one sort of silver lining optimism I have is that state revenue projections are rebounding, like ever so slightly and quietly. And I'm saying this quietly because I'm worried I'm going to ruin it and they're going to go down. But we need those revenue projections to continue to increase, because then the legislature can feel confident about putting together an actual budget, and the Baker administration will feel confident about signing that. So those are things that we're looking at. I have no idea when you can expect an email from Mass Creative urging you to connect with your lawmakers about the state budget process, but know that we will send those out as soon as we know as soon as we know. Next slide. Thank you. So I think another moment of optimism is that 1.7 million Massachusetts registered voters voted in the primary last month. That's unbelievable. And that is in the face of a pandemic that has made many people feel unsafe about going into public spaces, with new mechanisms and processes for mailing in your ballot. 1.7 million eligible voters did. And that's great news. And I think that has to do with a lot of people and a lot of organizations turning their attention to the need to strengthen democracy in this moment. And so I want to encourage all of us on this call to just keep in mind three sort of really important things that are coming up. So on September 22nd, it's National Voter Registration Day. Then on September 30th, it will be the end of the 2020 census data collection efforts. And then on October 24th, it's the deadline to be able to register in the November 3rd general in Massachusetts. So as my colleague and I would say election guru Jay Cottle said, you can register to vote anytime in Massachusetts, but if you want to be able to vote in the November 3rd election, you have to do it by October 24th. So all three of these things are places where we as an arts and cultural community have a role to play in making sure that our immediate circle is engaged in elections and in the census collection and data, and that our larger audiences and networks and communities are. So I hope you will consider ways that you can engage your networks in all three of those items and make sure that we are moving forward the needle of strengthening democracy. I also just want to put a flag out that my non-optimistic moment the other day was that our census collection data is under the rates that we want for Massachusetts as a whole. And then specifically in Boston, the self-reporting is still really low. And as we've talked about on this call before, and as many of you know, but it bears repeating, the census is directly related to the allocation of federal resources to Massachusetts. It is directly related to our state, local, and federal representation in terms of elected officials. And as Audrey Serafin pointed out, in the last census, we actually lost a seat in Congress. So this matters. And she also said this morning that an election can oftentimes inform the next 4 or 6 years, but a census informs the next decade. So this really matters, and engaging on this work matters too. So I'll stop with my soapbox on that. Ways to engage. Who are your 5? Who are the 5 people in your immediate circle that you're going to talk about with these items? Become a poll worker. We know that that's a place where we need more help and more support, and you can get paid for it, which is a good thing. And then mass vote. There are a number of different advocacy organizations that are doing phone banking to get the vote out. One of them is Mass Vote, and we encourage you to take a look at that. And Kelly Gifford writes in the chat, this Thursday, September 10th, So yesterday, museums and artists across the country joined in a larger initiative called Plan Your Vote. Collectively, we'll be sharing graphics created by artists between now and Election Day that direct readers to nonpartisan voting site vote.org to get information about what they need to do to plan their vote. And they'll have a voter registration every Thursday and weekends at the ICA. Way to go, ICA! Gold star, A+. I believe I'm done. Thank you for the time. I hope this update was helpful.
Thanks so much, Emily. And now we're going to move to Ruby Harper from Americans for the Arts to give us a quick update.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here, but not excited to share the update that I've got. I tend to be the bearer of doom and gloom, so forgive me. I want to first share that we have been maintaining a coronavirus COVID resource center that includes access to the data points that I'm going to share in just a moment, and then also other resources that are both localized and national in scope. There's news, there's an advocacy toolkit, there's a lot of information there, including information on equity and mental health, which also is an element of the pandemic and what we're dealing with right now and will be continuing to deal with. So I will post that link. Oh, actually, it's been posted for me, so thank you. I do invite you to visit and let us know if there's information that you have that you think would be helpful to others in the field. We're constantly updating it. And we do have a weekly email that is a news and resource roundup that goes out once a week. So if you'd like to be added to that, there is information also on that page. And it is part of our local arts network listserv. So if you are already a member of Americans for the Arts, you'll just want to log into your member account and select that listserv to be added to it in order to get that news digest. So as I promised, the bearer of doom and gloom, so far we have been tracking the impact of the pandemic since early March. We've had several different studies running. I think the one that's probably of most interest to you all is what we have in terms of an update on the nonprofit arts and culture sector impact. Financial losses continue to grow incrementally as we make our way through this extended closure period. Right now, we're at an estimated $12.5 billion in financial losses. 96% of organizations have canceled events since the onset of the pandemic, and some have canceled as far out as summer 2021. So we know that for a number of organizations, the end is still, quite a number of months away. This is resulting in a loss of 354 million admissions and 11.2 billion in audience spending. So that's the extra stuff that happens when folks go to arts and culture events, restaurants, lodging, retail, parking. So the total economic impact of organizational and audience spending losses is coming in at 4 billion in lost government revenue and 701,000 jobs that are no longer being supported. So far, we've had about 18,000 survey responses. So we're getting a really robust survey sampling. And within all of that, we know that about 30% of the respondents have laid off or furloughed staff. 10% never closed, though, which is really interesting. And we do have a 14% rate that have already reopened. 22% plan to open in 2020 still. And then, as I mentioned, 6% plan to start their opening processes in 2021. But about half of the respondents are indicating they don't have a target date for reopening. And, that hinges on, some challenges as folks are talking about and directing reopening parameters, boundaries, instructions. And so we're watching the manifest of that in the responses that we're getting. As Emily was talking, we've also initiated the Creative Workers Back to Work movement. And so we've also been initiating a study around the impact on individuals. Right now, we have 63% of respondents, it's almost a 25,000 survey response sample, have reported they're completely unemployed. They have no income coming in. They've reported an average loss of about 22,000 in creativity-based income. We know that about 80% have experienced a decrease in creative work that's generating income. 76% are unable to even access supplies, resources, spaces, or even the people that are necessary for that creative work. What we are finding, though, is that Black, Indigenous, and artists of color have higher rates of unemployment than white artists due to the pandemic. So we're looking at about almost a 70% unemployment rate versus 60% for their white counterparts. They also expect to lose a larger percentage of their 2020 income. And we're looking at that as a 61% versus 56%. So, even as we're hearing that the pandemic has a disproportionate impact on communities of color, that is manifesting no less in our artists as well. So we are updating those stats on a weekly basis. I will pop the link to that document in the chat box here for you if you're interested in looking at the most recent report. It is available again on our resource center, as are several different dashboards that you can access in order to look at more localized information, or if you want to see what the national picture looks like, or if you want to do some comparative survey analyzing as well. So, in all of that, I think the last thing I want to share to just kind of offset some of the doom and gloom is that, the arts and culture communities continue to be some of the most generous in the country in terms of the support that they're providing to their community colleagues and the way that they are boosting community morale, the way that they are using their expression and creativity to help chart paths forward as we all continue to move through this experience. So, while I think there's still a lot of challenges ahead, I think, as always, the arts are going to be resilient and innovative and creative in finding our paths forward. So with that, I just want to say thank you for having me, and keep up all the great work. Hang in there. We're not alone.
Thanks so much, Ruby. Great. I know I saw some questions in the chat, but I see they're being answered. We have about 12 minutes left of the meeting. If there are any other questions people have for any of our speakers today, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them before our time is up. Cara, was there anything you wanted to add, or any of our other speakers?
No, I think I have a question for Danny. Danny, are you still on? Yeah. I was just wondering, with all the colleges and universities still having to provide like quality of life and experiences for their students, do we think that there's an opportunity to make a connection with some of the virtual programming that could maybe be more local than what they normally do, or like to try to like connect the dots a little bit more? Like, can we be connecting, whatever virtual thing they're trying to offer to students to some of the organizations that are on this call?
In terms, I'm trying to figure out what you're asking exactly. And
I'm just thinking, like, I'm assuming that all of them still have contracts to provide programming to students, but now it all has to be virtual. And so that might be shaking up what they normally do. I don't know if that's come up at all.
it hasn't, but that's really, I'm actually jotting this down as an agenda item for one of our next check-ins with them. That's really interesting, because you're right, everything has moved pretty much virtual at this point. So what's going to take up that space is a really good question.
Looks like, Emily, you also have a couple other questions here, or one other question.
Yeah, I'm seeing one from Johanna in the chat box. So I will apologize to you that my grasp on the FEMA and local assistance program is not as tightly as I'd hope, but I think my understanding is, and if anyone on the call wishes to correct me, I am welcome to it, is that basically the state administration has to like formally request it from FEMA, right? And then they release the funds. And I think you have to request it in like 6-week increments. So that's why it's like, oh, okay, you get it for this 6 weeks. So there, I knock wood, there's reason to believe that they are right now writing that application proposal for the next 6 weeks. But if anyone is like, Emily, why don't you understand this better? Please here's what the truth is. Please tell me. And I'll also look to get an answer for you that we can share at the next update.
Any other questions from folks or things that people want to share? I know that, internally we've been having some conversations from a tourism perspective as well, which we could connect to this conversation maybe at our next meeting, tracking numbers about how visitors are returning to places that have reopened or not returning, where are they coming from? So that's something that we could bring into the mix, because tourism has come up here a couple of times in the conversation today. Question for Danny. Any exceptions for sports?
Yeah, actually, that's a question I can't answer off the top of my head. I know that there are like separate sports guidelines from the state that have come down. I will need to look into that and get back to you, because I'm not entirely sure where that puts college sports.
And Ruby, can I ask, so Nina's fantastic open office hours and drop-in hours, which are really a great resource for organizations to think about, like, how are you navigating the various programs that are out there. Does that also include the federal assistance program, since it's not like an org can't apply, or an individual can't directly apply to FEMA?
No, right. I was saying that if anybody had more individual questions, the office hours are still available. I think if there's more of that, more structural money or access, it's probably better to hit up Narek or Peter J. The Gov Affairs group is definitely going to have more information on that. Not to say that Nina wouldn't, but the office hours are really about that individualized navigation. And then since I have a second, I'll do also a quick plug for an ArtsU video primer series that we produced about just 101 overview information about all the different federal programs that have been made available through the CARES Act that folks can access. That way, if you can't attend, or if you want to listen to the videos before you attend, we're finding that those are helpful for folks just to also make more information available and accessible. And those are free and open to folks, member, non-member, field wide. So if there's colleagues that you have that you think that would be helpful for them, certainly share that information as well.
Thanks for that, Ruby. We do have one more question. Dan asked, so there's still a chance that there will be a fourth stimulus bill and also another 6 weeks of FEMA support after this initial 6 weeks, correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's a chance that there'll be a fourth stimulus bill if you're a very, very optimistic person, right? Like, what we're sort of seeing is we don't have a lot of confidence that there'll be a fourth stimulus bill before the November election. And then obviously once that election happens, I think we'll sort of get a better sense of what we can expect after that. But so it's not off the table, but I don't think we're going to see a lot of quick movement on that, which again, I want to reiterate, is really frustrating in a moment where we are all feeling the real-time effects of this and wanting to see the federal government hopefully bring more state and local aid, right? And bring unlock more dollars for all of us. And then the other piece is the additional 6 weeks of FEMA support after the initial one. I'm going to check and double check and see if that's possible, but I would assume that if there is money that is available from FEMA, that the Baker administration, right, because it has to be from a state executive leadership administration position, can apply for, they will do that. So I guess, Dan, unfortunately, my answer is maybe. And I don't want to take this lightly. I just, it's very squishy. And so we're trying to navigate that.
Thanks, Emily. I don't see any other questions. Just looking through.
That's one other thing I'll add on the MCC schedule. We are being given the date of October 1st to open the Boston Cultural Council grants for those who have been waiting for for that timeline. So we're confirming that right now. That puts us about a month behind where we normally are. And I'm not sure, if that is a date that might move or not, but right now that's what the MCC is publicizing. So that's what we're going with. But it has real immediate implications for all of us if there isn't a clear budget going forward and quickly, because once that if that date starts to slide or there's some complications there, then that's our main source of funding, other than a city match for that funding that supports our local cultural council grants. So it's hugely important. BCC grants are Gen Ops now. So it's based on your budget size. It's just general operating funds. We're keeping it as kind of simple and straightforward as possible. We're also looking at updating the reporting requirements, so it's almost nothing. We're just trying to streamline it. Okay. Feels like that's it. Any last questions? Thanks everybody for hopping on today. And we will see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please reach out to me or Pascal, and have a good weekend.